Here is The Cat and the Mouse. Once upon a time, in a little village surrounded by green meadows and shady trees, a clever cat and a timid mouse became the most unlikely of friends. The cat, sleek and agile, had a voice as smooth as cream and a knack for charming everyone he met. The mouse, small and cautious, had spent her life darting from one hiding place to another, always wary of the world. But when the cat promised to be her friend and protector, she decided to trust him. The cat asked one fine day why they shouldn't live together. The winter will be here soon, and it's far better to face it together. He wanted them both to live in a warm little house, and the cat said that he will make sure no harm comes to the sweet little mouse. The mouse thought this sounded like a wonderful idea, and she agreed, but said they must prepare carefully to store up food so they'll never go hungry. The cat nodded and said, "Of course, we are dear friends, and I know just what we need, a pot of fat. It will keep us warm and full all winter." So together they went to the village and found a lovely pot of fat. The mouse beamed with pride as they carried it home, but she asked where they would keep it. The cat thought for a moment and claimed to have the perfect idea. "They will hide it in the church. No one would ever dare take it from such a sacred place." The mouse agreed, and they carefully tucked the pot beneath the church altar. They claimed that they wouldn't touch it until the snow comes up. "Not a single drop," promised the cat, though his whiskers twitched just a little. The cat and the mouse settled into their cozy home, and the days passed peacefully. But one morning, as the autumn leaves began to fall, the cat woke up with a curious gleam in his eye. He told the mouse he had some exciting news. His cousin just had a new kitten and had asked him to be the godfather at the christening. The mouse clapped her tiny paws, saying how wonderful and that they must go at once. "I will," said the cat, "but I'll miss you when I'm gone. I promise to think of you the whole time." The mouse waved him off with a cheerful goodbye, but the cat didn't go to a christening. Instead, he trotted straight to the church where the pot of fat was hidden. "Just a little taste," he told himself. He licked the top of the fat clean, savoring its rich flavor. Then, feeling quite satisfied, he strolled through the village before returning home. When he came back, the mouse was waiting eagerly. "How was the christening?" she asked. "What name did they give the kitten?" "Top Off," said the cat, licking his whiskers. "Top Off? What an unusual name," said the mouse, but she didn't think much of it and curled up for a nap. A few weeks later, the cat woke up with the same gleam in his eye. "My dear mouse," he said, "you'll never believe it. My cousin has had another kitten. I've been asked to be the godfather again." The mouse was delighted. "How lucky you are. Off you go, and have a lovely time." Once again, the cat went straight to the church. This time, he ate half the pot of fat. "Delicious," he purred, licking his paws. Feeling full and happy, he returned home. The mouse asked once again how was the christening, and what was the kitten's name. "Half gone," said the cat with a sly grin. "Half gone? That's even more unusual than the last one," the mouse said. "What funny names your family has." The days grew shorter, and the wind grew colder. One frosty morning, the cat stretched lazily and said, You'll never guess what's happened. My cousin has had a third kitten. And of course, they've asked me to be the godfather." The mouse tilted her head. 3 christenings in 1 season, that's quite a lot. But the cat said that this kitten is very special and that he simply must go. So the mouse nodded and said that she will hold down the fort for a while he's away. The cat hurried to the church, his mouth watering at the thought of the fat. This time, he finished the whole pot. "Now it's truly all gone," he said, patting his belly. Humming a little tune, he returned home. "What name did they give the third kitten?" the mouse asked. "All gone," said the cat. "All gone?" The mouse frowned. "That's the strangest name yet." But the cat only yawned and stretched. "You wouldn't understand," he said, and went to sleep. Winter arrived, blanketing the world in snow. The little mouse shivered as she looked out the window. "It's time to fetch our pot of fat," she said. "It will taste so good now." The cat stretched and gave her a slow smile. "Yes, let's go." Together, they walked through the snow to the church. But when the mouse uncovered the pot, she gasped. "It's empty. How can this be?" The cat flicked his tail, looking utterly unconcerned. "Well," he said, "I suppose I may have had a taste or two." "A taste or two?" the mouse squeaked. "You ate all of it, didn't you?" "Top off, half gone, all gone. They weren't kittens. You lied to me." The cat looked at her with a gleam in his eyes. "What did you expect, little mouse? I'm a cat." The mouse's whiskers trembled with anger. "You're no friend of mine," she squeaked. "How could you have done this to me?" The cat smirked. "You're lucky I didn't eat you too." The mouse backed away, realizing the truth. Though she had trusted the cat, she had always known deep down that cats and mice weren't meant to live together. And so, she scampered off, vowing to never trust a cat again. The cat, now satisfied and fat, watched her go with a shrug. "Such is life," he said to himself. "A clever cat will always get what he wants." And though the mouse had learned a hard lesson, she lived the rest of her days safely, never again fooled by sweet words or charming smiles. As for the cat, he went back to his sunny rooftop, where he spent his days basking and dreaming of his next indulgence. And so, the world carried on, just as it always does. Here is the Frog King. Once upon a time, in a land where dreams were believed to come true, there lived a kind and noble king who had 3 daughters. Each was beautiful in her own way, but the youngest shone like the morning sun. Her hair gleamed like spun gold, her voice as sweet as birdsong, and her smile could brighten even the cloudiest day. So lovely was she that even the sun, who had seen the whole world, paused to admire her whenever it passed over the royal castle. Near the castle, there was a grand forest, filled with whispering trees and hidden glades. In the heart of the forest stood a deep, clear well beneath an ancient tree. On warm days, the youngest princess loved to wander into the forest, carrying her favorite toy, a golden ball. She would sit by the well's edge, tossing the ball into the air and catching it again, the sunlight glinting off its shiny surface. One summer afternoon, the princess sat beneath the tree, her golden ball gleaming in the sunlight. She tossed it high into the air, but this time, instead of landing safely in her hands, the ball slipped through her fingers. It bounced once, twice, and rolled straight into the well. The princess cried out, leaning over the edge to see where her ball had gone. The water was so deep that she couldn't see the bottom. Tears filled her eyes, and she began to cry softly. As she wept, a small voice spoke up. "Why are you crying, young princess?" Startled, she looked around. At first, she saw no one, but then a frog poked his head out of the water, his bright green skin glistening in the sunlight. "What troubles you?" he asked again. "My golden ball has fallen into the well," she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "I will never get it back." The frog tilted his head thoughtfully. "I can fetch it for you, but what will you give me in return?" The princess quickly replied, "Anything you like. My pearls, my jewels, even my golden crown." The frog shook his head. "I have no need for jewels or crowns. What I want is your friendship. Promise that you'll let me be your companion. Let me sit beside you at your table, eat from your golden plate, and sleep on a silken pillow in your room." The princess hesitated. A frog as a companion, she thought. It seemed silly, but she wanted her ball back, and so she said, "I promise, dear frog, whatever you ask." Satisfied, the frog dived deep under the water. Moments later, he resurfaced with the golden ball in his mouth. He set it on the grass, and the princess snatched it up joyfully. "Wait," croaked the frog as she turned to leave. "Take me with you." But the princess, too excited to remember her promise, hurried back to the castle without a backward glance. The poor frog was left to watch her go, sinking back into the cool water with a sigh. The next day, the princess sat at the grand dining table with her father, the king, and all the royal court. The golden ball was safely tucked beside her, and she had all but forgotten the frog's request. But just as she took a bite out of her meal, there came a soft pitter-patter on the marble staircase. A knock sounded at the door, followed by a familiar voice. "Youngest king's daughter, open to me, by the well water, what promised you me?" The princess froze. Her heart began to race as she remembered her words by the well. "Who is at the door?" asked the king, noticing her uneasy expression. She stammered that it's just a frog, and that yesterday she had lost her golden ball in the well. The frog fetched it, and she promised to be his companion, but didn't think he would actually come. The king frowned at this, telling her, "A promise is a promise, my child. Go and let him in." Reluctantly, the princess opened the door. The frog hopped inside, his large eyes sparkling as he looked at her. "I have come for what you promised," he said simply. The princess led him back to the table, where he asked to sit beside her. She hesitated until the king gave her a firm look. She picked him up gingerly and placed him on the chair. Then, when he asked to eat from her plate, she slid it toward him, though every bite she took afterward seemed harder to swallow. The frog, however, ate heartily and thanked her politely. When the meal was over, the frog looked up at her again. "Now I am tired," he said. "Take me to your room, so I may rest on your silken pillow." The princess felt tears prick her eyes. How could she let a cold, wet frog into her beautiful room? But once again, the king reminded her of her promise, and so she carried the frog upstairs and placed him in the farthest corner of the room. That night, as the princess prepared for bed, the frog called to her from his corner. "I am tired, princess. Bring me to your bed, or I will tell your father." Her patience snapped. Furious, she picked up the frog and threw him against the wall with all her strength. "Now leave me alone, you horrid creature." But no sooner had he hit the wall than a dazzling light filled the room. When it faded, a young man stood where the frog had been. He had kind eyes, dark hair, and a warm smile. "Who are you?" the princess whispered, stepping back in surprise. "I am a prince," he said. "A wicked witch cursed me to live as a frog until someone would take me as a companion, not out of pity, but as a true promise of friendship. Your actions, though reluctant, have broken the spell." The princess stared at him, her anger melting into wonder. "I never imagined." "With your father's blessing, will you join me in my kingdom?" he asked. The princess nodded, her heart feeling light for the first time since she had met the frog. The next morning, the king gave his consent, and a splendid carriage drawn by 8 white horses arrived to take them to the prince's home. As the couple stepped into the carriage, they were greeted by the prince's servant, faithful Henry. Henry's heart had nearly broken when his beloved master had been cursed, and he had bound it with 3 iron bands to keep it from shattering. Now, his joy was so great that the bands began to snap, one by one. As the carriage rolled along, the prince heard a loud crack. "Henry, is the carriage breaking?" he asked. "No, my lord," said Henry with a smile. "It is the band around my heart, breaking from happiness." Twice more, the sound echoed through the air until all 3 bands were gone, and Henry's heart was free. The prince and the princess traveled to his kingdom, where they were welcomed with celebrations and joy. Over time, the princess came to see the happiness and strength in the prince, and they grew to love each other deeply. As for faithful Henry, he served them loyally, his heart light and unburdened. And so, they lived happily ever after, proving that even the most unlikeliest of promises can lead to the greatest of joys. Here is the Bremen Town Musicians. Once upon a time, in a quiet little village, there lived a hard-working donkey who had faithfully carried heavy sacks of grain to and from the mill for many years. But as time went on, the donkey's strength began to fade. His once strong legs grew tired, and his masters noticed that he could no longer work like he used to. The master began thinking of replacing him, and the donkey, overhearing these plans, knew it was time to leave. The donkey decided to set off for the town of Bremen. He had heard they were always looking for musicians, and thought that he could become a town musician. Feeling hopeful about his new purpose, he trotted down the road, humming to himself. Not long into his journey, the donkey came across a tired, old dog laying by the side of the road. The dog's tongue hung out as he panted heavily, looking as though he had been running for miles. The donkey understood immediately. This was a dog who had grown too old for hunting. Left behind by his master, the dog had nowhere to go and no idea what to do next. The donkey suggested the dog join him on the road to Bremen, where they might both find new beginnings. Together, they could become musicians. The donkey playing the lute, and the dog beating the drum. The dog liked the sound of this plan, and so they continued down the road, side by side. A little farther along, they came across a cat sitting in the middle of the road. She looked so miserable that the donkey and the dog stopped to ask what had happened. The cat explained that her hunting days were over, her sharp teeth had dulled, and she no longer wanted to chase mice. All she longed for was a warm spot by the fire, but her mistress had no use for her anymore and had threatened to get rid of her. Now, the cat was lost and unsure where to go. The donkey, always full of ideas, suggested that the cat come along to Bremen and join their little band. After all, a cat could serenade beautifully. Her soft purring would surely add charm to their performances. The cat, intrigued by the thought of starting over, agreed and joined the group. As the three new friends continued their journey, they came to a farmhouse where a rooster sat atop a gate, crowing loudly. The rooster explained that he had been announcing the good weather all morning, as was his duty. But now he had overheard the mistress of the house planning to turn him into soup for Sunday's dinner. His loud crowing, he explained, was his way of making the most out of what little time he seemed to have left. The donkey suggested that instead of becoming soup, the rooster should come with them to Bremen. His powerful voice would make the perfect addition to their musical group. The rooster, eager to escape his fate, agreed, and so the four companions set off together. The journey to Bremen was long, and by evening, the four friends were tired. They decided to spend the night in a quiet forest they had come to along the way. The donkey and the dog lay under a large tree. The cat climbed into the branches to rest, and the rooster perched high on the very top, where he could keep watch over the group. As the others drifted off to sleep, the rooster noticed a faint light in the distance. Curious, he called out to his friends, waking them and pointing out the light. They all agreed that a house would make for a much more comfortable resting place than the forest floor. Together, they followed the light, which grew brighter as they drew closer. At last, the light led them to a cozy-looking house nestled in the woods. Peering through the window, the donkey saw a table laden with food and drink, surrounded by a group of robbers, laughing and enjoying themselves. The donkey's stomach growled at the sight, and the others agreed that a feast would be just the thing to lift their spirits. But first, they needed to find a way to scare the robbers out of the house. The four friends came up with a clever plan. They would combine their talents to create the loudest, scariest noise the robbers had ever heard. The donkey placed his front hooves on the windowsill. The dog climbed onto the donkey's back. The cat perched on the dog, and the rooster flew to the very top. Once they were all in place, they began their performance. The donkey brayed loudly, the dog barked, the cat meowed, and the rooster crowed with all his might. The noise was deafening, and to make things even more frightening, the group burst through the window, shattering the glass and causing a tremendous commotion. The robbers, terrified by the sudden cacophony, leapt from their seats and ran into the woods, certain that some horrible monster had invaded their home. They didn't dare look back. With the robbers gone, the four friends settled themselves at the table and helped themselves to the feast. There was more than enough for everyone, and they ate until they were full. Feeling content and sleepy, they decided to stay the night in the house. The donkey stretched out in the yard. The dog curled up behind the door. The cat made herself comfortable by the warm fire, and the rooster perched in the rafters. Exhausted from their journey, they all fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. Meanwhile, the robbers had stopped in the woods to catch their breath. From a distance, the house now looked quiet and dark. The robber captain, thinking they had fled too soon, sent one of his men back to investigate. When the robber arrived at the house, he crept inside, tiptoeing through the dark kitchen. Looking for a candle, he saw what appeared to be glowing embers on the fire. But when he reached out to light his match, he accidentally touched the cat's bright, glowing eyes. Startled, the cat leapt at him, scratching and spitting. The robber, panicking, turned to run, but as he darted towards the door, he stumbled over the dog, who growled and bit his leg. Staggering into the yard, he was met by the donkey, who delivered a strong kick with his hind legs. Finally, all the noise woke the rooster, who crowed loudly from the rafters, as if summoning the entire forest to come and chase the robber away. The poor robber fled back to his companions, trembling as he told them what had happened. He claimed the house was guarded by a fierce witch with sharp claws, a man with a knife who had stabbed him in the leg, a giant with a club who had struck him in the yard, and a judge on the roof who had shouted to capture him. The robbers, now thoroughly frightened, decided never to return to the house again. The four friends, delighted with their new home and the safety it provided, decided to stay. Though they had set out to become the Bremen town musicians, they found they were quite happy in the little house, living together and sharing their talents. And so, the donkey, the dog, the cat, and the rooster spent the rest of their days making music and enjoying their friendship, proving that even the most unlikely companions can create the happiest of endings. Here is the elves. Once upon a time, in a quiet little village, there lived a kind but poor shoemaker. He worked hard every day, crafting shoes with care, but despite his efforts, times had grown difficult. At last, he had only enough leather left to make one final pair of shoes. That evening, he carefully cut the leather into neat pieces, ready to sew them the next morning. With a tired sigh, he commended himself to God, crawled into bed, and soon fell fast asleep. When morning came, the shoemaker rose early, said his prayers, and sat down at his workbench. To his astonishment, there on the table stood a pair of shoes, perfectly finished. Every stitch was flawless, and the shoes looked as though they had been made by the finest craftsman in the world. The shoemaker was amazed, and didn't know what to think. Later that day, a wealthy customer came into the shop. He admired the shoes so much that he paid more than their worth. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather to make 2 more pairs. That evening, as before, he cut the leather and left it on the table. But when he awoke the next morning, The new pairs were already finished, as beautifully made as the first. This strange and wonderful pattern continued. Each night, the shoemaker prepared his materials, and by morning, the shoes were complete. Word of his fine craftsmanship spread, and customers came from near and far. Soon, the shoemaker was no longer poor. He and his wife lived comfortably, all thanks to the mysterious help they received. One evening, not long before Christmas, the shoemaker said to his wife, "We must find out who has been helping us. What do you think of staying up tonight to watch?" His wife thought this was a splendid idea. So, they lit a candle and hid themselves beneath some clothes hanging in the corner of the workshop. They waited silently, their hearts full of curiosity. At midnight, the door creaked open, and in came two tiny men. They were no taller than a child's hand, and wore no clothes at all. The little men climbed onto the workbench and began to work. Their nimble fingers stitched, hammered, and sewed with astonishing speed and skill. By the time the shoemaker and his wife could blink, the shoes were finished. Then, just as quickly as they had come, the little men scampered away into the night. The shoemaker's wife's heart swelled with gratitude. "These little men have made us rich," she said, "and we must show our thanks. They have nothing to wear and must be so cold. I'll make them little shorts, coats, trousers, and stockings, and you, dear husband, can make them tiny shoes." The shoemaker agreed, and together they spent the next day crafting tiny clothes and shoes for their helpers. That evening, instead of leaving out leather, they laid out the gifts on the table and hid again to watch. When midnight came, the little men appeared as usual. They hopped onto the table and saw the clothes and shoes. At first, they were surprised, but then their faces lit up with delight. They dressed themselves up quickly, singing as they worked. "Now we are boys so fine to see. Why should we longer cobblers be?" They danced and skipped around the room, leaping over chairs and benches with joy. Finally, they danced out of the house and into the night, never to return. But the shoemaker and his wife prospered ever after, and their hearts were always warmed by the memory of the kind little helpers. But in this same village, there once lived a hard-working servant girl. She was kind, clean, and cheerful, sweeping the house each morning and keeping everything in perfect order. One day, as she emptied her sweepings onto the heap outside the door, she noticed a letter lying on top of the pile. The girl couldn't read, so she took the letter to her master and mistress. To their surprise, it was an invitation from the very same elves. They had asked the girl to stand as godmother at the christening of an elf child. The girl didn't know what to do. She had heard that it wasn't wise to refuse such invitations, so with some encouragement, she agreed. That evening, 3 elves came to fetch her. They led her deep into the forest, to a hollow mountain where the elves lived. Inside, everything was small, but more beautiful than anything the girl had ever seen. The walls sparkled like jewels, and the baby's cradle was made of ivory and gold. The elves treated her kindly and made her the godmother of their little child. After the ceremony, they invited her to stay with them for 3 days, filling her time with feasting and merriment. The girl had never known such happiness. At last, when it was time to go home, the elves filled her pockets with gold and led her out of the mountain. But when the girl returned to her master's house, She was in for a great shock. She picked up her broom to sweep as usual, but strangers appeared and demanded to know who she was and why she was in the house. She explained herself, but to her surprise, she had learned that she had not been gone for 3 days, as she had thought, but 7 years. In that time, her old masters had passed away, and life in the village had moved on. Though saddened by the changes, the girl was grateful for the elves' kindness, and with the gold they had given her, she was able to start a new and comfortable life. But the story of the elves does not stop there. Not far from the shoemaker's village, there lived a young mother who was heartbroken. Her baby had been taken from its cradle by the elves, and in its place, they had left a changeling. The changeling had a large head and staring eyes, and it did nothing but eat and drink all day. Desperate to get her child back, the mother sought advice from her neighbor. The neighbor told her to try a peculiar trick. "Take the changeling into the kitchen," she said. "Set it on the hearth and boil some water in 2 eggshells. The sight of it will make the changeling laugh, and once it laughs, the elves will have no power to stay." The mother followed the advice. She placed the changeling on the hearth, lit a fire, and filled 2 eggshells with water, placing them over the flames. When the changeling saw the tiny eggshells being used as cooking pots, it burst into laughter. "I am as old as the Wester Forest," it cried, "but never have I seen anyone boil water in an eggshell." At that moment, a group of tiny elves appeared. They returned the mother's baby, safe and sound, and whisked the changeling away. From then on, the mother and her child lived happily, never troubled by the elves again. And so, the elves, though mischievous at times, brought blessings and wonder to the lives of those they touched. Whether helping a poor shoemaker, showing kindness to a servant girl, or teaching a mother to outwit their tricks, the little folk proved that magic, mystery, and gratitude could bring joy to even the simplest of lives. And if you listen closely, on quiet nights, you might just hear their laughter echoing through the forest. For our last story of the night, here is The Wedding of Mrs. Fox. Once upon a time, there lived an old fox with 9 magnificent tails. He was proud of his cleverness and thought himself a very fine catch indeed. But one day, he began to suspect that his wife, Mrs. Fox, might not be as loyal as she seemed. To test her, he decided to play a little trick. Stretching out beneath the bench in their house, he lay perfectly still, pretending to be dead. Mrs. Fox, not knowing what her husband was up to, went up to her room to grieve. Downstairs, her maid, a clever little cat, kept busy tending to the house. She stirred warm beer with butter on the fire and hummed a tune to herself. Word soon spread that Mr. Fox had passed away, and it wasn't long before suitors began arriving at the door. The first knock came early in the day. The cat opened the door to find a young fox standing there, looking hopeful. He greeted her politely and asked what she was doing. The cat, who had always enjoyed a bit of banter, told him she was cooking something warm and inviting. But the young fox waved it off. he wasn't there for refreshments. Instead, he asked if Mrs. Fox might consider taking on a new husband. The cat scampered upstairs to deliver the message, her tail swishing behind her. She found Mrs. Fox sitting by the window, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The cat explained that a young fox had come to woo her. Curious, Mrs. Fox asked, "How many tails does he have?" "Just one," the cat replied. Miss Fox shook her head. Her husband had had 9. "Only one tail? That won't do. Send him away." The cat returned to the door and politely turned the suitor away. But soon after, another knock came. This fox had 2 tails, but even that wasn't enough for Mrs. Fox. "Come back when someone matches my late husband's 9 tails," she said. One by one, suitors came to the door, each with a tail more than the last, but none met Mrs. Fox's high standards. At last, a dashing young fox with 9 glorious tails arrived. The cat hurried upstairs to tell Mrs. Fox the news. This time, she smiled. "At last," she cried, "let him in, and prepare the house for a wedding." The maid flung open the doors, and they carried old Mr. Fox's body outside to make way for the celebration. But just as the music began to play, and the feast was about to start, something incredible happened. Old Mr. Fox suddenly jumped up from under the bench. He wasn't dead after all. With a snarl, he chased the suitors from the house and scolded Mrs. Fox for her lack of loyalty. After that, it's said that Mrs. Fox lived a much quieter life, but her story didn't end there. In time, old Mr. Fox truly passed away. This time, Mrs. Fox grieved properly, but before long, she found herself wondering if she might marry again. News of her widowhood spread through the forest, and soon suitors began arriving once more. The first to knock was a wolf. When Mrs. Fox's new maid, also a clever cat, answered the door, the wolf asked if he might speak to Mrs. Fox. "Is she looking for a new husband?" he inquired. The cat dashed upstairs to ask her mistress. Mrs. Fox asked a very specific question. "Does he have red stockings and a pointed mouth?" When the cat returned with the answer, no, Mrs. Fox dismissed the wolf. After the wolf came a dog, then a stag, then a bear, and even a lion. But no matter how grand they were, none had the red stockings and pointed mouth Mrs. Fox desired. Each one left disappointed. Finally, late one afternoon, a young fox arrived. When the cat asked him the usual questions, he proudly showed off his red stockings and sharp, pointed muzzle. The cat ran upstairs with the news, and Mrs. Fox's eyes lit up. "At last, the perfect match," she exclaimed. "Let him come in and prepare a feast, and throw open the windows to let the fresh air in. This is a new beginning." The house was soon bustling with preparations. The cat swept the floors until they gleamed, laid out a grand table, and made everything as cheerful as could be. Mrs. Fox herself was in high spirits, feeling young and lively again. When the young fox entered, he was dashing and polite, and he quickly charmed everyone. The wedding was a grand celebration, filled with dancing, music, and laughter. The forest animals came to join the merriment, and even the birds sang in the trees. And so, Mrs. Fox found happiness once more. She and her new husband lived together in harmony, delighting in one another's company.